Raymond! It's Raymond! Oh, it's Raymond. What's going on, Raymond?
Not much. How are you?
I'm doing fine. It's great to see you. Great to see you. I hope you're doing all right.
Good, good, good. I thought I'd just drop in. It's my first time, so.
Well, it's a delight to have you, my friend. I have your Ivan Illich series I'm looking forward to getting into. I'm a big Ivan Illich fan. His book, Deschooling School, was magnificent. And he's another example of one of those thinkers that gets kind of left behind like Virilio. And you're like, oh, this guy's a genius. Look at that. So I appreciate that work. And Javier, I was listening, the work that you were doing about how space and our concepts of space structure thinking, I think is extremely true. I think generally our interpretation of space and time is the non-rationality that organizes our rationality afterwards. And it's actually really funny because I was just reviewing, So I have this paper that I've been wanting to write forever that I started writing on what I want to call the modern Counter-Enlightenment, which I think was an overlooked line of thinking in modernity that's not post-modernity. And I think Paul Virilio, I think Marcis Blondel, I think Peter Geek, a number of thinkers are all in that. And I think Virilio would be as well. And the modern Counter-Enlightenment is going to actually ultimately be philosophical thinking that is not based on, say, stable identity, but processes, relations, time, and ultimately a critique of A as A. Here's the key difference. Post-modernity deconstructs A as A, where counter-modernity negates A as A for what I call AB, which is Hegel's science of logic. And that's going to be the notion. So, for example, Owen, you know how Paul Virilio wants to talk about that the essence is unveiled in the accident, or that speed impacts how we think or technology. Well, if thinking was based on stable identity, then technology shouldn't impact rationality, right? Ideology shouldn't impact like a Zizek or the Foucault and all these people shouldn't affect thinking, right? But in fact, it very much does. And also our historic moment impacts how thinking develops, right? So likewise, Javier, what you're talking about is our understanding of space as, say, being primary impacts that to me is the initial phenomenological experience that then structures the nature of our rationality that we often don't even realize is there. And it was interesting, and then I'll pass it to you to comment on, whoever wants to comment, because I was reviewing Vico's critiques of Descartes as Descartes' thinking being too geometrical. And I was also reviewing Weinstein's critique, Whitehead's critique of Einstein for the block universe as being too spatial. And it's interesting how both of those thinkers were like, hey, you're not taking seriously the active involvement of the subject in the understanding of, say, objectivity and its construction of that. And as a result, you're making a universe that we're alien in. And what you were saying on the hermeneutics of space, Javier, made me think of that Vico-Descartes debate. And Vico's also critiquing Newton. You know, Gimpas, he wrote The New Science, he's critiquing Newton. And Whitehead, and I'm really trying to understand Whitehead's critique of Einstein better. He seems to be saying that Einstein assumes some sort of curvature of the universe that then can only be measured if you assume that. And that seems to be, it's like a self-defeating principle that he seems to be critiquing Einstein on. And if that's not true, then Whitehead's like, hey, you can't really be talking about time as an illusion or relative, you know, that's going to change everything. And the subject has to be actively involved in the unfolding. So I liked what you were saying, Javier.
Well, thanks, Daniel. It's funny because a hermeneutics of space is actually what got us in the problem of object and subject in the first place.
Right.
The very fact that you see things in your perceptual field. The point of a perceptual field is actually to just orient yourself in the world. But the moment we made the mistake of incorporating that in our thinking was that we started thinking, oh, look at this thing in front of me. It's against me. It's opposite from me. It's different from me. We started automatically going like, oh, there's a subject-object dichotomy. And this is a kind of hermeneutic of space. This is what I'm critiquing.
Right.
But it's funny because I am advocating for a different kind of hermeneutics of space because we're sort of missing the picture here. Meaning like, for example, in space, there's actually an element of forgetfulness, just to kind of capitalize on what you've been saying. So for example, there's actually a lack of spatial awareness. How does that lack of spatial awareness come about? It's very simple, right? You look at an object, then you pan somewhere else, and then it comes back. You have the capacity to look at something, forget it, go back to it, and look at it again. Which leaves room, in my opinion, for what deconstruction has, or at least Caputo and Derrida keep talking about, like the absolute surprise, where I forget and then I run into a pole, right? I have a sort of lack of spatial awareness going on. And it's kind of funny too. But I think you're absolutely right. Like there is this something about like our obsessions with geometry, symmetry, even time itself. I'm like, it began with the movement of the sun. This is how we had any association of time. And then we've abstracted it into numbers. And actually, it's funny because Whitehead actually talks about how we got numbers. And how we got numbers was that we had to look at animals in groups. Space allows us depth and proximity, to which then we applied numbers to them. And then we abstracted that and got numbers. And it's so funny that this is actually a hermeneutic of space. This is how we got this. And that's why I think science, when it's doing its mathematical theories, it's really just a hermeneutic of space. The very fact that you're talking about curvature and anything, it's space allows you this. Now, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not saying that we should necessarily do away with this. I think there is a sort of necessity to it. However, I think there's a problem, just like the way you've been talking about. I think there's a problem if we believe that's all that there is. Right. If we believe that everything is just A equals A, which it's not. and like that's like the main like thing I'm like trying to point at. And what's very critical about my critique is that a hermeneutic of space gives you the illusion of sovereignty. What is the illusion of sovereignty? The illusion of sovereignty is that your very positioning in the world, you think that that is actually what gives primacy to the subject. So for example, when I say that I experience something, I am literally in space, privileging what I am taking in to the world. And so when people talk to each other, they say, well, you weren't there. I was there. I saw it. Right? So there's this kind of illusion of sovereignty going on. And then also with the idea that the more I occupy space, the more powerful I feel. This is the more like ancient understanding of how we began. But the thing is, even now it's become abstracted where it's not that we're occupying land per se, unless we want to talk about Palestine and Israel, but there's a sense in which when we refer to people that are higher, we use those language, we use that spatial language that somebody is higher, above me, beyond me. I am lower, oppressed, little, beneath. It's very spatial. It's a very spatial understanding. It's very spatial thinking.
A few comments on that. It's interesting because if I look at the laptop and think about the laptop, I think about it, right? I say that is a laptop. And that's when A is A applies, right? Because it's like the identity. But if I don't think and just meditate and literally turn off your thought and just what I call perceive, A is A doesn't apply. And for me, I call this the dialectic between thinking and perceiving. And that's kind of the foundational paper for the reconstructing A is A. A is a special case of thinking. Whereas in perceiving, what do you actually observe? This is what's funny. When you just perceive, you know what you observe? You observe change. You observe time. I cannot actually, in non-thought perception, make a meaningful distinction between the bookcase and the wall unless I say those are not the same, right? But there's kind of an arbitrariness in saying that the bookcase and the wall don't have anything to do with one another. And that's where Whitehead and all of them are like, there's always relation, right? And if you decide that relation is non-ontological, you decided that relation is non-ontological. So there's an arbitrary connection there, right? And so in perception, time is dominant, which is more AB because change, A is becoming B and so on. Whereas in thinking, AA is how you describe it because you start dividing up. So thinking is very spatial. Perception is very time. And it's kind of funny because perception is also very apophatic. You can't, it's just like this bigness that you can't break up. So there's like an apophatic structure in perception that you're automatically reducing, as Ebert will say, compressing into thought, which is then spatially understood. And it's always going back and forth. And basically what has happened is the Enlightenment really has emphasized spatial thought or A is A thinking, right? Which of course is extremely valuable for science and has an extremely valuable role. But what the modern counter-Enlightenment thinkers realized is that that has to be positioned in a dialectic with time and space, perceiving and thinking, and a more subjective involvement in the object. And if you don't realize that, then you're going to unintentionally have thought be organized by a non-rationality that, frankly, ultimately the state will probably control. Frankly, the corporations will probably control. And so this dialectic between thinking and perceiving is extraordinarily important to avoid capture and to really get an understanding of how thought works. And really, when I understand Whitehead and Bergson, who I've really been very impressed, and I've watched him a few times, but have been trying to get more into it with the Footnotes, the Plato guy who does a lot on Bergson and Whitehead. Someone put an email on him. He's very impressive. And really, as I'm coming to understand it, basically Whitehead is like, look, Einstein, we're not saying that your understanding of time is false. What we're saying is that there seems to be two kinds of time. I think it's duration and something else. And so likewise, it's kind of like perception and thinking, subjective time, objective time. And that then, again, a reason why I think the science of logic seems to be kind of the birth of a lot of this is that you have subjective logic, objective logic that is coming out in the science of logic, and it's this dialectic. But those are some thoughts I had for anyone who would like to speak. You ready? Like,
I'm just gonna hold the cat like this.
Yeah, that's
like,
oh my gosh, that is
something to say.
so good for the algorithm. Javier has a cat as well. I'm the only one who doesn't, actually. Well, it makes me think. So, as Virilio so famously says that to invent the ship is to also invent the shipwreck. That's part of why A is problematic, because you don't just invent the ship. You also invent the entire horizon of possibilities of which that new isness relates to, right? And so that is what has to be taken into account. So likewise, if you invent certain technologies like the cell phone, you also invent the potential to be addicted to it, right? You create the entire technological horizon that comes with the creation of that isness. And that is where you start getting into A-B thinking. And that's where A-B thinking seems really critical to avoid, say, Deleuzian capture, techno-rational capture, the turning of everything into standing reserve. Because if you only have space as your non-rational foundation to organize your rationality, well, then whoever controls space controls rationality, right? So who is the capitalist people that own the space? How is technology changing your space without you realizing it? And then the problem is, if you associate objectivity with greatest truth, well, the object of the cell phone becomes greatest truth, right? And so all of rationality is then in service of that horizon.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because all of our politics over the past, let's say, few years is a good example of how our politics have become extremely spatial because of all these rules, 2-meter rules, social distancing, personal bubbles, don't travel too far outside of your area. We're kind of in a very spatial political tensions at the moment.
No, I think your work on Plato's Cave, the Notes from a Pod, on the notion that everyone has a certain spatial orientation that people have, that then as a result impacts their political participation, their notion of what's moral, stay home. There's kind of an ethic for that. Like, people's relation to space radically impacts their ethics, their ontology, like everything is shaped by that as a non-rational foundation. And this is why I think what Javier is kind of saying on how our interpretation of space and time, which I do think is the foundational non-rational premise that organizes rationality as a result, is really a big deal, because then it impacts politics, ethics, all these things. And that's a big deal, I think.
Actually, another example, I'm doing a driving test soon, so I have to get a few lessons. And I did a driving test about 10 years ago. And back 10 years ago, there's a lot of rules that have changed. So I'm having to learn these new rules. And basically in the past few years, they've changed from prioritizing you being in control of the vehicle to you being aware of your spatial surroundings because of safety. So that all the kind of rules that are coming in now are you have to show the instructor that you're super aware, there's no one around you and so on. And my instructor was telling me the reason this is because pedestrians and people on e-scooters and all these new sorts of vehicles are extremely unaware. So the driver now has to be super aware of their spatial surroundings. So I thought it was funny because it's humanism is very much about rational control. So you can nearly see the old version of being can I control the vehicle? Am I kind of rationally in control? And this kind of post-humanist era we're entering into is very much about like, how aware are you and how do you interact with this space of which you have no control over?
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, and also I'll just add, and then Javier can speak. If indeed space is the foundation of, say, power and truth, then everything is about controlling space, right? And what better way to control space than genetic manipulation, right? These spatial entities that then you can change how they unfold. What better way than to turn everything into AI, which can be programmed or data or computerized? Like, it becomes incredibly rational to transform all spatial environments into something utterly manipulatable, because if you can utterly manipulate space and space equals power, then you are all powerful, right? You become omnipowerful. So I think what Javier is saying also, it definitely has political and economic consequences. And then, of course, economically, the name of the game is to control all space, to own all space, to turn all space into standing reserve. And that would get into Heidegger. But with that, I'll give it to Javier to speak.
Oh, yeah, I mean, absolutely, Daniel. This, I mean, even the fact, like, we talk about diversity, it's about places. The fact that diversity needs to be in specific positions of places, that we understand that there's diversity. Like, it's a crazy thing, but I do agree with Derrida, or at least with Caputo understanding of Derrida, that I think honestly our hermeneutics of space is actually the logic of the same. It has a tendency to literally absorb and reappropriate anything, like anything. That's the danger of it can just swallow literally everything. And so, like, whatever we're talking about, like whatever, like opposition, like this is a funny thing, like this is where like the Hegelian dialectic really shows itself, because the hermeneutic of space is always going to be swallowed by the Hegelian dialectic. Like, whatever people think they are opposed to, like I'm a liberal and I'm against Republicans, like boom, you have swallowed yourself in the Hegelian dialectic, because you are talking about a hermeneutic of space. Now, what gets me interested is when you start talking about time, it makes me think we have a subjectivity that is very spatial oriented. The very fact that we talk about safe spaces, even in our conventional language, we talk about, hey man, you're crossing the line, like, don't get too close to me, don't get in my bubble, like it's a very spatial thing. What gets fascinating to me is, how do we think a subject that is not spatial but time? How do we think a subject that is just pure time? Because actually there's a quote from Dall-E where he wrote like fucking centuries ago. He says, being is time. Like, being is time. But it has kind of haunted me in that sense of like, what does it mean to be a subject that is time? And I think this kind of goes into why there's been thinkers thinking about process and relation. Because what happens is, if you have an identity that's predicated on space, well, we get self-relating negativities everywhere. That's all that's going on. It's just a constant feedback loop of just negative, self-relating negativities everywhere. And people can't seem to let go of that. But we forget, what was the point of being in the world and knowing something? The point of being in the world, and I'm going to play on this concept, right? When I think, was it Aristotle that said we all desire to know, right? What's the point of desiring to know? The point of desiring to know isn't certainty. And I think that's where the hermeneutics of space got in, mixed with our perceptual field. Like, we go, oh, you see this bottle? I see this bottle. Okay, cool. That's certainty. No, it's not. That's your interpretation. You're adding that on there. You're adding the idea of certainty just because you're looking at the bottle, just because we can all see the bottle. What's the point? What's the point of this? The whole point was for relation, in my opinion. It's because we want to relate to the world. We want to know the world the same way that we want to get to know somebody. When you say that you want to get to know somebody, it's not that you want to get some type of certainty about them, even though I would say we conflate this now. we definitely conflate this now when we say like, oh, I want to know them so I can be sure, I can be certain that this is the right person. But actually, to get to know somebody is actually a sort of romantic gesture of like, I really want to know you. It's a passion for relation. This passion for relation has obscured itself into the illusion of sovereignty and certainty. And now we're in this, vacuous hole of spatial subjects and spatial power and so on.
When you said safe space, I thought about Plato's cave. I'm like, man, what a safe space.
A few things real quick and then pass it to whoever to speak. I think definitely. So if objectivity was a term that meant high probability that this is an object that's shared across between perceptions of different people, that would be a different matter, right? Like, it's like there's a kind of objectivity that is, you and I probably generally see the same notepad right now, right? And there's that kind of objectivity that's based across people, which seems valid and actually necessary for social and political life. But then there's a meaning of objectivity that's come to be like vertical, that's come to be mean this notepad in its notepadness has some sort of connection with deepest ontological being, right? And that seems to be kind of different. And even if there's validity to it, I think those two uses of the term of shared objective reality for the possibility of social life has been conflated with ultimate truth, capital U, capital T, when those are different matters. And you see, that's basically, as I understand Whitehead's concern with Einstein, basically what's going on. And the same with Foucault and Descartes and all these people. It's like, hey, by all means, there needs to be a shared object horizon so that we can compute the world. But if you reduce everything to that object horizon and treats that as the only dimension of being, as ultimate reality, that tends to be reductionist, very problematic, and we tend to be controlled. And then problematically, whoever controls space controls everything. Whoever controls the environment controls everything. Whoever controls the city controls everything. And here's the funny thing about that, and then I'll pass to whoever wants to speak. If you accept the premise that space is everything, and then you seek to find full identity in space and you fail to do it, what's going to happen? You're going to self-remember, you're going to lose self-forget, you're going to enter the self-relating negativity we've talked about, that is existential anxiety. And then in order to escape that, you know what you're going to do? Look more to space, entertainment, distraction, of which the very response then to a space-centric way of life then makes the space-centric way of life stronger. You see what ends up happening. So the political power arranges power according to space, of which then leads to self-relating negativity, that then people are like, this sucks. And then they go to the movies, entertain, and go into their pod, as Raymond has put it, in response to that space-centric structure that then makes the space-centric structure stronger. And that's ultimately my critique of postmodernity as opposed to the counter-modernist movement, is postmodernity ironically just makes modernity stronger, because all postmodernity did is give us scientism. Like, postmodernity did not stop scientism. All it did is make scientism, because postmodernity then is like, these are kind of ironic, jokey, silly, comical people that don't know what they're doing and are just kind of dancing on the edge of the void. Okay, while you do that, us mature people are going to go build the Hadron Collider over here. Us mature people are going to build the singularity over here. So then the very reaction against pure scientific thinking ends up actually helping the scientific thinking because it seems absurd. You see what occurs. And so that's why AA has to lead into AB. It has to lead into a negation sublation of AA into AB. If it's simply a deconstruction of AA, it actually helps the space-centric thinking unintentionally. It thinks it's a response to it, but it ultimately is not. And that's actually why I think it is so important to make a distinction between postmodern thinkers and counter-enlightenment thinkers. Like Virilio, Florensky, Kawabasca, I can keep going. These are different than what, say, Adorno, Marcuse, and those people are doing. But they all get conflated together because we don't have the category in our mind of counter-enlightenment thinkers. It's all just postmodern or modern, or now metamodern with sprinkles on top, whatever you like to do. And that has actually helped power be more powerful, precisely by that lack of clarification. But with that, I'll give it to whoever likes to speak.
One thing I noticed about this group of like Virilio and Illich and so on, they actually came before the postmodern thinkers. They came in the 60s and 70s. And the more I look into these people, Rife, I'm not sure if you include Rife in that category too, maybe. Yeah. But Virilio, Rife, Illich, and I'm sure I'm going to learn more of them as time goes by. But these people, like, there seemed to be like a massive awakening in the 60s and 70s, and then it got completely ignored. And then you went into the postmodern era. And then now in the 2020s, it's like, oh shit, they were onto something. So it's funny how that worked. It was like, it would, like, you know, it was like this, it took what, like 30, 40 years kind of delay for the actual conditions to kind of set in, for us to be like, oh, they were onto something. Oops, you know. So our critique of modernity is very much kind of hijacked nearly by the postmoderns. And the real critique of modernity happened before that, and now we have to try to bring that back. So it's funny how that worked out.
I really appreciate what you said. It is so important to understand that the modern counter-enlightenment was prior to postmodernity. It was not in it. It was an alternative train of thought so another way to put it is, I'll say postmodernity is a reaction to modernity, while counter-modernity is an alternative tradition to modernity, actually, because there is a root to the counter-modernity found in the Scottish Enlightenment, in the Counter-Enlightenment with Hartman and all of the people Isaiah Berlin talks about. There's also strains of it in Tocqueville and Burke, but really there was a tradition of counter-Enlightenment thinking that was basically forsaken and forgotten and lost, but it actually, the kernels of it were kept alive in thinkers like a Blondel, a Fontaine, a Guise, a Corbett, etc., that were then just overlooked precisely because the doctrine of Enlightenment, modernism, and techno-rational thinking was so strong. And then it created a false, I don't want to say false because there's truth to postmodernity, but I would actually argue the good stuff in postmodernity are actually found in counter-modernity as well. That's kind of the irony of it. So modernity created a response to it called postmodernity that was almost like in Snowpiercer, where the rebellions are part of what keep the people in power, right? Where the revolution is a mechanism of maintaining power. And that's all postmodernity has primarily done. And now you have people realizing that in the form of metamodernity. But the problem is metamodernity is a term that nobody agrees on. You have Greg Denver saying it's a cultural analysis, other people saying it's a new spirituality and a new ageism. All of that is okay. And I actually have become more familiar with the metaphysics of adjacency that Layman Pascal talks about. And I'm quite fond of that because I think that is an example of counter-modernity ontology that is needed. But metamodernity does not at this point recognize a tradition that it should actually hook up into, because basically all those thinkers were lost. Right. And now I'm trying to figure out a way to like really define the counter-modernity. I'm defining it increasingly as thinkers who really focus in on a critique and sublation of A is A as an ontological foundation. That seems to be a big deal. That seems to be part of it. Rieff does not have a particular essay on that, whereas someone like Florensky or Korobaska does. But Philip Rieff is absolutely aware that both modernity and postmodernity is not a response to modernity. He's 100% sure of that. And Peter Berger, all those sociologists are aware of it. You also have people like Gueron, Gueron, who is aware that quantity is going to kill us all unless you bring in quality, which is a Hegelian notion. And that's inherently AB, because quantity is spatial, which is funny because it seems like it's abstract and not spatial, but actually the counting is an acknowledgement of space. That's very important. So any of the tyranny of quantity is also in service of modernity. And so people like Gronian are thinkers about that. But no, what you just said right there, Owen, is a big freaking deal. It's so important that there is this class of thinkers that are not responding to modernity, but a tradition alternative to modernity that has completely been lost. And I think I think like basically the father of it might be Vico, Gebaskia Vico, who wrote The New Science in response to Newton and Descartes. And arguably Newton and Descartes are your main fathers of modernity. Now, that's not to say you can't go before the 1670s and find plenty of theologians and philosophers who are alternative to doctrines of beings, but they're not counter to the Enlightenment. You see, like the Enlightenment is a particular period of time that gets mixed with economic, technical, and bureaucratic concentrations. Whereas, if you could say Heraclitus is an example of a counter, but he's not responding to a certain economic reality. So if you place it in Vico, then you can follow it up all the way to Laban Pascal if you wanted, but you put it in Vico. But anyway, let me give it to Javier.
Wait, did you say is Foucault part of the Counter-Enlightenment? No, or you?
Vico, Vico, Gimabowski Vico. He's like a hyper genius nobody read. He's another example of a hyper genius that was forgotten. He's like unbelievable.
Dang, you guys are going to send me the links to all these books then, because I'm extremely interested. So yeah, I agree, Daniel. The idea that postmodernism was like, okay, let's go against modernism. But you see, this is the trap of the logic of the same. The moment you do for like basically a direct opposition, the same. What's interesting is, and I like Derrida's twist on this, is that we don't need direct opposition. He says something actually very genius. He says, we just need a slight bend. Like just a slight bend. Like you don't do a direct opposition because you're gonna get assimilated into it. And I think that's what modernity has done to postmodernity. It basically just Pac-Man'd it. But I like the idea of this slight bend. It's almost like instead of direct opposition in terms of like humor, you would do something like a pun or like a parody of, where it isn't even like a direct opposition, but it's like a slight bend. It's a sort of mimicky kind of thing. But I wonder what the Counter-Enlightenment, I wonder if it is this kind of slight bend that nobody paid attention to. Because we like to pay attention to the direct oppositions rather than the sort of slight bends that is going on.
100%. I'll just comment on that. We love fights, and also the issue is
if you take the counter and the modern Counter-Enlightenment seriously, then you are reconstituting A as A. You're not saying A as A is wrong. You're saying it's a special case to thinking. Okay, you're saying it's a model that is very useful, but all models are wrong, ultimately, as Box tells us, right? We learn this in computer science and things like that, right? Well, if you do that, if you say that A as A is not going to be the adequate model for all phenomenon, well, now you're in Hegel's Science of Logic, and reading that sucks. That book sucks. Oh my gosh. Obviously, now I read it 10 years ago, and there's a bunch of books I've been rereading that I'm like, I never read them. That's how it feels like. I mean, clearly the words went in front of my eyes because I underlined stuff, but I don't think I read this actually. Like I've had that experience with a number of people recently. I'm like, wow, I thought I read you. I guess I didn't. And it's very clear that if you start saying, no, logic must take seriously the subjective experience or the subject or the historic moment and be constituted by the horizon of the encounter of the object and the subject, everything gets crazy real fast, man. And so we don't want that. We'd much rather like pretend like postmodernity is the adequate response to modernity because that's still operating within a principle of identity, right? And ultimately, I want to argue that Deleuze, as I understand him, is the logical extreme of postmodernity, because what you get in Deleuze is a metaphysic and ontology of where everyone is their own ontology. So you're A as A, I'm B as B, O and C as C, Michelle's D of D. Everyone is their own letter and their own unique ontological expression, and that's what I call essential difference. But that's not AB. That's just saying everyone is a one of one AA. But that is the logical end of postmodernal thought that's still operating in response to A as A and thus accepting the premise of A as A. You see what I'm saying? Now, Deleuze's stuff on technology, his stuff on, his literary, that's all really grand. But here's the thing. Deleuze actually shows you that the ultimate end of postmodernity cannot escape modernity. You see, that's kind of the point. Like if you follow Deleuze to the logical end, you don't escape modernity. You're still operating in modernity. And you actually, the big argument I make is that Deleuze is very well of technological capture and avoiding capture. And he proceeds to create an ontology and metaphysics to avoid that, that makes everyone like basically defenseless to it. Because the way you stand against capture is frankly relation, community, and like coming together, right? But he gives you a metaphysic that makes relation impossible because everyone is their own essence that cannot be comprehensible to one another. So in his very diagnosis of the tendency of technology to capture us, he then gives us a metaphysics that makes us very unable to avoid capture. But for him, he's like, well, you can avoid it if you have your own line of flight, right? Like your own line of flight, and then you're not going to be kept. That's true, Deleuze. That's true. So basically anarchism. Like basically everyone has their own line of flight, and that is a solution. I mean, if everyone goes off into the mountains and they're, you know, a spiritual guru and they're their own essential essence, well, that's fine. That would work, but it would be the end of society, or it would be everyone is a tribe. So Deleuze gives you a response, but here's my problem. This would then be my final point. I'll give it to whoever wants to speak. Deleuze gives you a solution to the problem of capture that's so absurd that it makes modernity seem right. You see how the reaction then seems, the reaction to modernity actually then is in service of modernity. Because what Deleuze poses as the solution ultimately is kind of absurd. So you go, well, I guess the scientists and the technocrats were right. Because you don't have the alternative of the counter-enlightenment. You see what I'm saying? This is why my big argument is Deleuze unintentionally actually feeds the problem he diagnoses. Like Deleuze very well diagnoses the problem of capture and fascism and all those different things, but then proceeds to actually make them worse by creating a metaphysic that makes relation impossible or meaningless. And because that then creates what Philip Rieff warns about, where everyone is their own mythos, in like the Jungian sense, everyone is their own mythology, that creates an existential anxiety that nobody can handle. And in that, they turn to a strongman. In that, they turn to totalitarianism. So that is how I would describe. Now, there may be a Deleuze scholar out there who everything I said is completely wrong, and I just don't know it. That's the problem about being wrong. You don't know you're wrong, so forgive me. My take on Deleuze is that he unintentionally worsens the problem he goes out to solve, because the only way to solve the problem that he rightly diagnoses is with an A-B ontology. And you cannot do that by turning everyone into an AA. That is not A-B. That is just a reproduction of A is A within every individual essence. And therefore, it doesn't avoid capture. So that would be why I don't think, and therefore, if Deleuze is indeed the most extreme and logical end of postmodernity, and in Deleuze, we do not see a solution to the power dynamics that we have described, then that means postmodernity is not the correct response. Right? And that it actually makes modernity worse in these terms of political and economic power, right? That's why, for me, recovering the modern counter-enlightenment is basically a huge freaking deal, because if you don't, you're just stuck on the postmodern track and you're not going to go anywhere. And people say, well, that's why we're turning into meta-modernity. Well, we will see if meta-modernity is in fact an alternative to Deleuze. I'm not sure at this point, but that it of course depends on who you ask and who defines what and so on and so forth. And yes, lines of flight, spatial, very nice, Javier, very nice.
Yeah, no, I like, I'm not 100% sure what Deleuze means by flight. I'm presuming he means like a sort of atom is a kind of path out of the whole of the unity. Yeah, see, like this seems to me to like be a kind of circular act nearly, because it's like they're finding paths out of this kind of like decaying unity, and then they're being drawn back in somehow. If you think about the internet, it's like, you know, we're gonna, you know, have our own individual space, our own niche, our own kind of different subjective views and everything. But then you just get drawn into this network in which everything you experience is mediated by this one monolithic entity. And then there's no actual real diversity in that kind of proper sense then. It's all monolithic, so yeah.
What you just said is exactly right. I completely agree. Because also the problem I
always have with Deleuze is, okay, who's making the like, who's making the internet tower so we can use the internet? right? Is it you in your line of flight, or is it someone else? Because if it's someone else that you're going to pay, then you have to have a relation. And if you have to have a relation, bam. The real of economics is always, like, I consider economics, you know how people talk about consciousness as the hard problem? I consider economics the hard problem of philosophy very often, because economics is what slaps you in the face. And it's like, who's going to do the pipes in your house? Oh, I don't know. And then all of that. But anyway, let me give it to Javier.
No, I mean, I think Owen hit it on the mark too. It's funny because the little that I did read from Deleuze, it's kind of funny because in some sense, it's like, yeah, you're right. How do you know that you have your own line of flight? How the hell do you know? Oh, that's right. You only know in relation to another person. Oh, that's right. How? Because the other person has to reaffirm to you that you have your own line of flight, which is exactly the problematic thing that we have going on right now, where you have people that can't affirm their own identities without some type of relation to the other. They cannot possibly affirm it without making you affirm it for them, right? And so, like, you completely we completely missed the mark on this, where it's like you can't even speak about your identity. You can't even know that you even have an identity without even having some type of relation to the other. And I feel like this is like the utter neurotic mistake that is happening right now. Like, I mean, people are like so obsessed with their identity. And it's funny because there's been so many moments where, you know, I think we've all had this moment where somebody like accidentally calls you like ma'am or sir or something, you know, and you kind of just like, you just like kind of think it's funny. Like it doesn't even matter. Like, oh, call me ma'am, you know, it's like, but the moment we mess up, or, you know, now at least with, you know, identity, they, them, so on, etc. I've noticed that there's this underlying existential anxiety that is perhaps more harmful than good with a lot of these people. Like, a lot of these people I've noticed have a really hardcore underlying anxiety that if you do not feed back to them their identity, they will literally lose it. Like they just don't know what to do with themselves. In fact, it's almost like you're forcing them to self-forget, but they don't want to self-forget. They want to know that they are what they believe that they are. But like, as Derrida likes to say, is I only know that I believe that I believe. Which I always like his phrase on this. Yeah, I believe that I believe, when he was asked if he believed in God.
Well, no, a few things. I think, ironically, to allude to Owen's work, when everyone has their own line of flight, that just means everyone has their own Plato's cave. Everyone just has their own cave. That's what ends up happening. Practically speaking, in an idealistic, beautiful, artistic sense, line of flight is this beautiful image of this bird going toward the sunset, and it's so nice. And it just turns out that that's the image on your cave. You know, that you're actually in your own freaking Plato's cave. That's the practical consequence of it. And what's very strange is what ends up happening today under the postmodern politics of acknowledgement is that everyone wants to be acknowledged in their unique difference. But how do you do that? Because I don't know your unique difference. So it creates this very neurotic kind of pathological relation. It's kind of like, imagine if God got mad at you every time you didn't refer to him as apathetic. Right? Like God's like, that's not apathetic enough. That's not apathetic enough. And you're like, but I can't even talk to you if it's truly apathetic. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. It's kind of like, for me, I associate Deleuze with a negative theologian, where every single human being becomes an apathetic subject. And in one way, that's absolutely true. But the problem is, you're not apathetic to yourself. Everyone else practically has to treat you as apathetic, which means the moment they relate to you, it's wrong. And yet at the same time, you need them to acknowledge your apathetic existence in order to make the essential difference meaningful. But the moment they do that, it's wrong. So everyone has this essential identity that is unique, that they express. That acknowledging is never right because it's never fully you. And the fact that it's not right means it's kind of a trespass against you. But then you need them to keep doing that so that you have a meaningful identity. And so it's always a problem, right? And this is both liberal and conservative, because conservatives now, it's like, I'm my own rugged individual. I made my own way. I've worked hard as a capitalist, and I want the government to acknowledge me. I want my country to acknowledge what America is all about, right? So conservatives are completely in the business of a politics of acknowledgement as well. Now you have to get into the difference between like a really big government that makes people feel like they can't run a small business and whatever, and you have to get into the difference between governments, say, banks redlining minorities where they can't get houses. There are absolutely particular policy problems that have to be acknowledged. And we talked about last time on a politics organized to incubate self-forgetfulness, and that indeed would have you go through policies that discriminate, policies that hurt productivity, and you would go through, because all of that actually forces a reflection back on yourself and entering the self-relating negativity. But the key is a movement from a politics of acknowledgement to a politics of self-forgetfulness, where you've just forgotten yourself and you're just doing your thing in the flow of time, because acknowledgement is inherently spatial, right? Because you are in space, I am in this point in space, acknowledge me, as opposed to forgetting space and kind of focusing on time or change or becoming. That's an entirely different socio-political structure. But Deleuze just ends up in everyone demanding acknowledgement of apathetic subjects that cannot be acknowledged as such, which just creates a pathological environment where everyone is crazy, basically. And when everyone is crazy, there's two responses. Totalitarianism, strongman to silence it all, or everyone goes off in everyone goes off into the unique custom-made Plato's cave while looking at a picture of a bird flying toward the sunset and feeling really good about themselves, and then tweeting some inspirational quote or something. Those tend to be, that's basically all A is A can lead you. Autonomous rationality, as I call it, which is A is A autonomous, must lead you to either everyone has their own private Plato's cave, or fascism, or totalitarianism, or social, like it's basically one of those two, a strong man of some kind. And, I forgot, we can go off in the wilderness and be spiritual gurus. We can also do that. That is an option, going off into the wilderness. So that's yeah, that's right. Well, the other thing I was going to say about the event, though, is not the event time-based. Like if your entire existence is based on the event, as Caputo and Derrida and, Mike Hinton talk about, then that is a kind of time-based. It's not located in space, it's time-based. So yes, this issue for me of understanding the modern counter-enlightenment, thinkers like Virilio, Illich, Reef, Feyerabend, I think Feyerabend in Against Method is a big deal in the scientific world. This is basically a matter of life and death. That's a little extreme, but it is kind of a huge deal. Like not recovering this history of thought is not good. It's bad. It's bad. It's not good.
But Daniel, I mean, this is perfect, right? Because even in a lot of negative theology, actually, I'm really starting to it makes me rethink actually about a lot of the weird sentences that saints and mystics kind of make, like, I was here and nowhere, I was there and nowhere, I was, nowhere and everywhere. It's funny because what is happening, I feel like actually, is that they are actually in time rather than in space. And I really like this framework because it's almost like to be in time is to really embody what it means to self-forget, right? Whereas in space, like you're just such a conscious awareness of like your positionality in the world, your being in the world. But again, I really do feel like the point of being in the world initially was that we just needed to orient ourselves, like move around objects, move things, interact with things. And then we just made the biggest red herring against ourselves when we decided to take it up as actual thinking, the way thought should actually be like. God, it's been blowing my mind that this has been the mistake for centuries. This is blowing my mind right now. I can't believe it, man. Now I see it everywhere. I'm like, it's a politics of space.
Oh yeah, it's where, I'll talk about phenomenological pragmatism. It's the mistake of
replacing phenomenology with empiricism, because empiricism is, and then if empiricism is the foundation for truth, then it has to be space. Whereas phenomenology is the observation of the unfolding of the phenomenon through time and its becoming, right? That's an entirely different ballgame. And this is, another thinker that's a big deal is Michel Ponier, who wrote The Phenomenology of Perception, which is a magnificent book. And he also, like, one of the examples that I make of him is, imagine you have a lion. Oh, and this actually fits really good with what you were saying. Imagine you had a lion, and it was right over there on the hillside. And I would ask you, what is the rational way to respond? You might go, well, I won't bother it. I'll just be quiet over here. But it's kind of far away, right? So like what constitutes rational is relative to distance. But if it was really close and looking at you, you may see, oh, I need to run, right? Your rationality will change relative to distance, right? If I would ask you, what is the lion? Or what is the lion capable of doing? From a distance, you would say, oh, it can run, right? But imagine you got so close to it, you could see the quantums. Right? Like you were so close to the line, you could actually see its quantum makeup. Well, now I can kind of jump through space and time, right? Now it's not located in like locality, they talk about, I guess, local and universal or whatever. So like its material makeup actually, and what is rational, like what is rational for quantum mechanics to do is different from what large objects in space and time can do, right? Like rationality and logic changes relative to how close you are to the phenomenon, right? And so basically what Ponier is getting at is that rationality is relative to positioning in space and time and how the thing moves and like all of these other dimensions. And he's like, and guess what? You can only know all of that through the movement of space. Like if you so here's the point. If you just freeze the lion on the hillside and like have that be an image, right? Like a configuration of space. And I would ask you, what is rational? Then you would conclude that it is always rational not to run when there's a lion, because they're always far away and they're not bothering you, right? So if you freeze frame, space, you get a different notion of what is rational, as opposed to if you play the whole movie of the lion moving through time and all these different positionalities in space, right? So basically what Ponier is trying to warn is that empiricism tends to generally treat reality as pictures, freeze frames, when actually there is an unfolding of phenomenon that rationality has to actively calibrate itself in relevance to that unfolding, right? And if you don't do that, you're going to get eaten, basically, right? So likewise, in a political, like this applies to technology, because often, like we have, like Virilio, we have to invent the ship to find out the shipwreck. It has to unfold through time. But once the shipwreck occurs, this is what we tend to do. This is our mistake. We tend to say the shipwreck is an outlier to the phenomenon of ship, and we should not redefine what is rational for the ship in light of the shipwreck, because the shipwreck is outside of A is A. It is not part of the identity of the phenomenon. But Virilio is like, no. The accident unveils the actual essence of it. It is not other from the operations of the phenomenon through time. It must be part of your identity of the phenomenon, and rationality must be calibrated accordingly. So this is a big deal because, for example, if technology unveils to you that it might make a nuclear bomb, or that it might make like attention deficit disorder, or result in everyone being in Plato's cave, what we naturally do is say, yeah, but that's exceptions to the rule. Normally, the computer's great. Normally, social media is great. Normally, it doesn't do these things. So we other the accident from the essence of the phenomenon, which leads to us continuing to rationalize the use of the phenomenon, so we never leave Plato's cave. And so that's why defining rationality relative to the entirety of the unfolding of the phenomenon is a big freaking deal, because if you don't do that, you will tend to fall into rationalizations that make you more susceptible to capture or more susceptible to getting eaten by the lion. So rationality must be relative to the entire unfolding of the phenomenon without falling into any temptation to other any part of it. Because if you do that, then you're going to rationalize getting on the ship. And then when it shipwrecks, you'll say, this isn't normal, as it sinks and you drown. So it's really important to entail the entire unfolding of the phenomenon in your logic, which is phenomenological more than empirical. Now, obviously, they overlap. Obviously, there are special cases where empiricism, scientific method, and all these things are insanely possible. The key is for us not to be monotheorists, as I call it, having a single theory or epistemology by which we understand reality. Instead, we need to be polytheorists with multiple theories relative to different phenomenons and different unfolding. But that's really hard, and we much rather be monotheorists, because then we have a single lens by which to think of everything. And if anything doesn't agree with that monotheory, we just other it and call it evil and stupid and whatever, and we go about our day getting eaten by a lion or something like that. But I'll pass it.
reminds me of our conversation. I can't remember if it was the conversation about Rife or the one on Notes in the Pod, but we were talking about the ability before where danger was obvious, where if Genghis Khan was at your like gonna raid your village, it's like, well, that's Genghis Khan, he's here. You didn't really have to think about it, you didn't have to read a book about it. But when you're thinking about something like biotechnology, or thinking about like the economic consequences of like supplying weapons to some country in a foreign country, there's this sort of like crumbling of there's this sort of inability, as you were saying, to like understand the lion is over there, but he could be here, you know, within a very short period of time. There's this kind of like, well, this seems to be a good thing to do. And it's as you were saying, like a kind of frozen picture. And we behave today, I think, as if the lion is going to be there on the hill forever, but he actually is walking towards us. And we're just, you know, like our perception of him is just stuck with him being on the hill, but he's literally just walking towards us. Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant association. I'll give it to Javier, because basically it used to be that the danger was given to us by the space. We could see Genghis Khan. We knew what sources did. So being space-centric was not so consequential because you could go out and see that the drought had killed the garden, right? Now, when our problems are more abstract, that requires the ability to think how time would unfold, or a probability of how time would unfold given the variables of that thing that you are examining. Well, that's no longer going to do to be spatial-centric, because if you're spatial-centric, all you're going to do is take your current moment and extend it into the future as the norm, and then you don't notice when the lion is eating you. So definitely with these new problems we have today that are an abstract unfolding through time, being space-centric utterly makes us utterly unprepared. And then I'm afraid Deleuzian ontology only feeds into the unlikelihood that we are prepared, because if we're all isolated, we're certainly not relating. And if we're not relating, we're not part of a collective consciousness. And if we're not part of a collective consciousness, our computing power is much worse. And so when everyone is using their brain power to emphasize their essential difference, or to defend their essential difference in their identity, then mental capacities are not being directed towards, say, avoiding capture by the algorithms or the technology. And so there's a radical weakening, where then the only collective consciousness that exists is the one in service of that technological capture, as opposed to a counter to that technological capture or modernist capture. And then we're really screwed, because that means like the supercomputer of human cognition is being used in favor of the capture as opposed to counter to the capture. So it all feeds together in a great, lovely problem.
I agree, Daniel. It's funny. I feel like I really got to read Virilio now because I feel like he's already been getting at what I've been talking about with the event. Because I found a way to explain this, Daniel, because I started reading from Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida from Caputo, where he talks about really, because the event is always promising to come, it also never arrives. But what's fascinating about this is that actually our current notion of events is actually very spatial, right? But if we take time seriously, every event is actually a non-event. It's a non-event. That means once you start realizing that everything is a non-event, you don't fool yourself into thinking that this lion is stuck over there. You keep saying, well, maybe it's still over there, but it could have gotten closer. It's just like the mirror when you look in the little like car mirror where it says objects may appear closer than they actually are. It's that sort of play on perception that we always need to have this sort of like, well, maybe, I mean, it could be all the way over there, but I mean, I really don't know if it's all the way over there. It looks like it's all the way over there, but also kind of looks like it's getting closer. So it's the very fact that we sort of label events, and events are just strictly spatially. Like if it's time, it's always a non-event, always. Why? Because you cannot determine the event without already knowing what the future is, without already trying to have some omnipotent knowing of the unfolding of it, basically. So it has to be a non-event. It has to be. And then what does that mean? It means that when events happen in space, we need to be prepared for a new relation to that event, always. Always, every single time. We have to be prepared for a new relation, which means a new relation means what? Another form of subjectivity that we have to prepare for. We have to prepare to fucking run. We have to prepare to run, to not get eaten, instead of staying and waiting, thinking, oh, it's over there. Maybe it is, but we don't really know.
No, that's absolutely, I mean, this all suggests why I've come to be very, like, Cadell had that talk with Layman Pascal on Metaphysics of Adjacency, and what, he's always talking about, that he was talking about, that I found very interesting, because I think it aligns with both, and I may have mentioned this, Mr. Ebert's paper on the sublation of mathematics, science of logic, Hegel, and also the Counter-Enlightenment movement and everything you're saying, because there really is this kind of notion that that 99% is a new 100%, there has to be room for incompletion, uncertainty, oscillation and slight differences. And yeah, you can get 99%. You can reach a place where you're like extremely certain that that the lion is not going to come for you. But there's always the maybe. The difference between 99% and 100% is a universe of difference. It's an unbelievable difference because there's just that little 1% that you're always open to that completely transforms how you carry yourself in the world. And it has political ramifications, debate ramifications, all these different things. And you see a lot of our current technocentric vision is basically like 100% is possible. A map that equals the territory is possible. We just need the AI to figure it out, right? The AI will figure out the calibration to make sure the lion never comes over here. Well, wait a minute. If Hegel's right, and I think this is Hegel, and the very nature of being, which is a lofty phrase, but granted to me, if the nature of being itself entails essential incompleteness, 99% instead of 100%, then a technology that makes the world 100% makes the world into something it cannot be. Therefore, effaces it. Not negated and sublated, frickin' effaces it. And that is a really big deal. This is where philosophy, ontology, all of this kind of lofty stuff is a frickin' big deal. Likewise, rather you think in terms of space or time is a really big deal. It seems abstract, doesn't seem like it matter, but unfortunately everyone's concrete and practical lives is relative to abstractions that tend to just be absorbed by the system so you don't notice it, but once you notice it, it's a big deal. So if it is the case that the nature of reality at most allows 99% because an essential incompleteness, girdle, all this stuff is part of being itself, then all technocratic visions to make a map equal the territory must be an effacement. It must be pathological. It must be neurotic, because if you're trying to make something that can only be 99% become 100%, you're destroying it. Right? You have to be destroying it. So this metaphysics of adjacency, all the stuff we're kind of talking about, they completely transform the role of technology in the world, in politics and economics and all of these things. And right now, when you have totalizing visions, which is the modernist dream, right? The modernist dream is a totalizing vision, a unified one, right? We are still living that. We have not escaped that. And postmodernity did not stop that. It just got manifest in the form of technology, corporations, all these other things. And so postmodernity has proved itself unable to stop the visions of the one, the 100%. This is why the Counter-Enlightenment is, the modern Counter-Enlightenment is such a freaking big deal. Like, that is the resources that have not been used. And all of these thinkers, Reef, Fontaine, Kawabasaki, go on, understood this problem. They understood that life was inherently 99%, not at most 99%, not 100%, and trying to get that last percent would end the world. It would cause totalitarianism, violence, death, and all these things. They understood that. They were forgotten, and recovering them is a big deal. And which brings me to saying why I always appreciate Owen's reading taste, because he's like the only person that reads these books, and I really salute you, my friend, because your reading tastes are magnificent. Owen is in the Counter-Enlightenment, the modern Counter-Enlightenment movement. Owen, I appreciate. I think, but yeah, this is a matter of like life and death, basically, in my opinion. So it's a big deal.
I think one of the things I'm drawn to about these Counter-Enlightenment thinkers is that they're in some form or another saying that we've lost the ability to respond to contingency or to danger through a sort of innate ability to respond to it. Like we're sort of transferring our control to systems which are under the illusion that they're 100%, as you were saying, but they are always 99%. There's always a sort of contingency there. I'm reading Illich's Medical Nemesis at the moment, and he's talking about how modern medicine, it's quite a radical, actually, critique of modern medicine. He's talking about how the fact that modern medicine teaches people to treat their suffering and treat their phenomenological experience of pain as something that is 100% curable. And by doing that, pain itself becomes intolerable. So people become neurotic, as we were saying. They can't tolerate any discomfort or pain. So we're sort of handing over the keys to the castle to this like promise of 100, but it's actually 99. And then therefore we have no home, is basically the way to put it. Yeah.
That's a beautiful connection. And Ivan Illich is a perfect thinker for this. And just to comment quickly, like you can have confidence, you know, right now, modernism makes you believe the choice is between nihilism or certainty. You know, the choice is either between nothing or everything, right? There's a middle category, confidence. I don't know that this computer is going to not blow up in the next 2 seconds. I cannot be certain of that. And there was evidence earlier that it can, but I don't have that certainty. I mean, that certainty, but I can't have confidence that it won't blow up in the next 2 minutes. I can have confidence in lots of things. The funny thing to what you were saying there is that certainty is actually incredibly fragile. A single doubt and it's gone. Whereas confidence, the funny thing is 100% is more fragile than 99%, to use layman's, language. You know, I can have tons of doubt and maintain confidence, whereas I can't have a single doubt and maintain certainty. You see? So when you have the modernist dream of certainty, which is the legacy of Descartes, I think, although I'm not a Descartes scholar, you know, I'm not an expert, but that seems to be, let's put it this way, the popular understanding of the Enlightenment, modernity, Newton, Cartesianism is a dream of certainty, which, you know, I think that's a fair generality. That's really fragile, and a single doubt is not allowed, and that has to totalize. Because you have to have a political system that removes all otherness, all sources of doubt, all adjacency, as layman will put it, all incompletion. And under that, how do you not have totalitarianism? Rather it be in school, politics, medical, it doesn't matter. Like if the name of the game is certainty, there cannot be any doubt. Whereas if the game is confidence, you can have, in fact, doubt is good because it proves your confidence. Then like doubt is actually good for confidence because it verifies the confidence, right? So confidence, the 99% is an entirely different ballgame than the 100, but let me give it to Javier.
Something that I really liked about Buber is that he talked about when it comes to like meaning, it's not about searching, which is funny because I think meaning is deeply spatial the way we talk about it now in conventional society, right? I want to find meaning. I want to be safe in my meaning, you know. And yet, Buber talks about we don't need to be searching. We need to be waiting. Why would we be waiting? Because it's unfolding. We never consider the idea that meaning is unfolding. Just to bring in Andrew Luber here, because I'm going to talk to him this Saturday. Because I was like, hey, Andrew, I think your ideas and my ideas, they need to become together. Because this very idea of waiting is that, like a story, the meaning of the story is not immediately known. The meaning of the story is always unfolding. And just like the story of the White Elephants by, what's his name? You guys know the story. You guys know the author's name. I'm losing it. You're saying it, Daniel. I know you're saying it, but you're muted. I forgot the guy. Ernest Hemingway. Dude, that elephant story is the most beautiful thing because that's exactly how meaning is. He leaves it just open-ended. You don't even know what the meaning could possibly be. All you do is you keep looking at the story, re-looking at the story, and you keep speculating about what is happening. What is the actual fundamental meaning about this story? And so meaning is unfolding. And yet we've taken identity as meaning. We've taken everything as a sort of static notion, the spatial positioning. And God, I really need to read Virilio now or Illich as well. Because it's funny, because what Owen said about this kind of like critique of like medicine is that actually psychoanalysis said this a long time ago concerning therapy. Like therapy is like, all right, we're going to cure you because we want you to function in society. So curing is related to function to society, going back to the spatial positioning in your daily life. Whereas psychoanalysis is like, yeah, we're going to be here for a while. In fact, you're going to deal with this thing for the rest of your life. The better thing, the better way to deal with your suffering is actually to have not a sort of cure against it, but to have a new relationship to it, which is the whole point of psychoanalysis, really. It's about having a new relationship to your suffering rather than trying to get rid of it and then assuming back into a functional society.
Yeah, you know, what you just said right there brings to mind why Christianity has profoundly declined because of the conflation of resurrection and ascension. Ascension is not resurrection. A resurrection is new life through death, through pain, through suffering. Paul has something in his hip that he never takes out. And that's really important. You know, as ascension and resurrection were conflated in Christianity, it became very Platonic. And once it becomes Platonic, then it becomes perfectionist and it's all about the 100% as opposed to the 99%. So that's exactly right. Also, you know, Dr. Nieberhauser has mentioned this, where today we tend to think about problems and solutions as opposed to how do we manage problems. Well, you know, problem solutions is certainty thinking. Problems management is confidence thinking, which is in the tragedy of Nussbaum. And the other thing I'll say is, what you just said about Luber and Story, and that's wonderful you speak to him, I love that guy, is that's, you know, for me, the phenomenology of the artist is, as I was saying earlier, that our initial experience of time and space tends to be the foundation, the non-rational foundation that organizes our rationality. The artistic experience, which is incredibly temporal and unfolding and a becoming of being that cannot be reduced to the immediate, is what for me is like I place at the foundation of thought. You know, I often place the foundational non-rational experience as aesthetic, and then aesthetic leads to epistemology. Epistemology then leads, you know, aesthetics leads to onto-epistemology, which then has to be reflected in your sociological, socioeconomic order. So making something akin to story foundational to rationality is insanely important, because if you don't do that, then you have a spatial foundation, which then leads to all of the trouble that we have mentioned. So, you know, that is kind of a way that I see the aesthetics, you know, the phenomenology of the artist, which you have really brought out in the language of timing and, you know, in like timing, because that's time to time, not space to time, or time in terms of space. All of those are incredibly important adjustments to foundational thinking that has radical ramifications that more aligns with the modern counter-enlightenment as opposed to modernism or postmodernism, both of which fail to bring any change in terms of escaping our custom-made Plato's cave.
I was just thinking about just to kind of throw out a kind of topic about the spatial crisis that we're talking about, or this spatial thinking. It's funny how the era of this spatial thinking has also been an era of being really disembodied. We're very much disembodied, and we're kind of rejecting the body. We want to have our heads just on screens. We want to put microchips in our brains to telepathically communicate. And obviously in the lockdowns and stuff, a lot of this stuff kind of got a bit weird and dystopian. But it's just an observation that like when we're talking about, ironically, it seems to me anyway, that spatial thinking is actually its own version of being like stuck in the clouds in its own weird way, because it kind of, as you're saying with the static image of the lion, it's like if you were really embodied, like you'd be like, that line's coming closer, like I can feel that line coming closer, we better do something. Where if you're completely disembodied and stuck in this kind of rational picture, even though that's entirely spatial, it actually doesn't let your body respond to the other bodies around it. It's completely static, and then you kind of have to ignore the bodily responses. Yeah.
That was a brilliant reply and extremely relevant.
All falsity leads to irony. You know, like the nature of human beings is irony. You know, if you want to say fallen state, we tend to fall into irony. And irony is where you do X for Y, and X is why you don't get Y. You know, the very thing causes its loss in a way. So like what ends up happening is like precisely in the since space is your centric focus, then the name of the game is to escape space in order to have power, as opposed to thinking in terms of timing. So disembodiment equals power if your paradigm of power is space. Mr. Eber, good to see you, sir. So ironically, what then ends up happening is that the way you get power is not to incorporate timing into your thinking, but to escape space, which then makes you disembodied, which then, of course, is a postmodern response to modernity that then doesn't have the power to correct modernity. It actually makes you more susceptible to capture, because using your book notes from a pod, everyone has their own personal custom Plato's cave. And again, this is why, and I'll pass it to Javier, whoever, Mr. Eber, good to see you, sir. And this is why realizing this strain of thought that was entirely forgotten called the modern counter-enlightenment is so important, because that is an alternative to modernity as opposed to a reaction to modern totalizing thought. But then again, of course, since you have a paradigm of A is A, the counter-modern enlightenment through your Kobaskis, your Fondanes, your Virilio, and different people is completely lost. So it is not by chance, because that's the irony. Like precisely when you're space-centric as opposed to taking time seriously, you can only have an ironic response, and that leads to having your head in the clouds, because in fact, reality is not autonomously spatial. So you are in an abstraction precisely when you think you're getting more concrete. You think you're being more concrete by being space-centric, but that is ironically an abstraction, because that does not function as such. That is not the case. So you get this ironic move that goes down.
I mean, I absolutely like when Nietzsche said that the self is the body, I think this was the move he was trying to make. Like this, we are disembodied. We have been living so spatially. Even the concept of transcendence is a kind of spatial idea, a spatial abstraction that we said, oh, isn't there something above, beyond? Isn't there something sort of doing this? Even the idea of like heaven and hell, these interpretations as places, is such a spatial understanding of the Bible and everything. Which is funny, because actually I feel like there's actually one Muslim thinker that I know that is actually a counter-enlightenment thinker, which is Muhammad Iqbal, because he strictly said that heaven and hell is not a place. He strictly said this, and he presented two notions of time in his understanding. So, and he was very critical about the sort of mystical notions as well, because it seems like they also fall into the trap of some type of spatiality. But nonetheless, I do think that it seems like some of the counter-enlightenment needs to be exactly on time, stripping away space, or at least, I would say in a very Buber way, we need to have a new relation to space by provoking time.
Well, the key is that, again, I was,
like I said, I enjoyed reading so much on Layman Pascal's, Metaphysics of Adjacency, because the notion is that space, the problem is when space becomes 100% as opposed to 99%, right? Like in all of these counter-enlightenment, if you're taking a Blondel that's going to be putting the emphasis on action as opposed to stable identity, then that's not to say that you don't have enough stability in order to have comprehension. You have enough quote unquote being in order to have comprehensibility. If you did not comprehensibility, wow, that's a good one. Comprehensibility, if you did not have that, you could not function. The problem is that slight move from confidence to certainty changes everything. Again, confidence, you can have all the doubt in the world and still have confidence, whereas with certainty, a single doubt, you lose it. Likewise, with 99%, you can have change, transformation, and all of that and still have your identity in terms of that 99%. But once you move to 100%, you're in trouble, right? And you have to have that stagnancy. So what you have is on all of these counter-enlightenment thinkers, just like with Benjamin Fontaine, where he's really emphasizing, he's like, look, the thing, he has this great essay on boredom, where he's like, hey, look, if you actually could achieve the modernist dream of an internally consistent system that entirely corresponds, that would be effing boring. And guess what happens when people are bored? When they know everything, they become violent, just looking for something to occur. It's almost like with your language, Javier, when you have a totalized and complete system, you get boredom because there's no possibility of event.
Like the loss of a sense of the possibility of event in a Capudian, a Derridian, or a Quentin kind of sense then leads to there's no possibility of event. So we have to make an event. We have to blow something up. We have to fight. We have to create some sort of activity. But the problem is, in that internal consistency, there's no possibility of surprise. So you can't have an intrinsic motivation in a kind of Nietzschean sense to be creative. It has to be causal based, which means it's spatial based, which means you have to change your environment in a manner that disturbs it as opposed to you create. And that's where you kind of blow stuff up. And you just mentioned One Punch Man. Yes. Yes, yes. And so that's kind of what Benjamin Fontaine was so concerned about. And then Korbowski, I mean, in his book, Science of Sanity, he's like, look, Aristotelian principles of identity, A is not how the psyche forms an understanding of the world. And if you try to do that, you're going to make everyone miserable because that doesn't work. His book, Science of Sanity, which is unfortunately abstract and costs $200 to get because they didn't print it anymore, is a masterpiece on a lot of this different thinker. But again, the moment you have a thinker that says Aristotelian logic is incomplete, everyone goes, that guy's crazy. He has nothing of any sense to say, and he gets othered from the conversation. And that's why you've had this development of the modern counter-enlightenment alternative to the modernist thread that occurred during and before postmodernity, that was completely lost in the noise of postmodernity, that postmodernity has some very, very valid things to say, but that tends to be at the overlap with the modern counter-enlightenment. And then, as I'm trying to argue in this paper, the modern counter-enlightenment is frankly the inheritors of the thinking of the science of logic and Hegel that often don't even realize that they're inheritors of that thought, and that actually are following a similar sublation of Aristotelian logic. And so losing all of it, and yeah, like you mentioned Dall, you can mention some of the Hindu theologians and different things. There is a sense of the problem of this that has been missed. And I think it's just, again, you just have these thinkers were warning what would occur if you did that. And here we are. And different things. Yeah, Mr. Ebert, I've been actually kind of reading over the sublation of mathematics and thinking it in terms of Layman Pascal's Metaphysics of Adjacency, which I didn't know anything about. And I was really taken on how his kind of thinking as a frame in terms of the science of logic, because I was reading the section on many and the one that Hegel talks about and that you reference in your paper and different things. And I was seeing overlap there. And I'm also have been trying to understand Whitehead's concern with the assumptions that Einstein made involving geometry to give rise to his thinking about the quote unquote block universe. So I was trying to get a better understanding of that. And that ultimately led to a discussion on not at 3, so there's no need to comment on, but it ultimately led into something I like to call the counter-modern enlightenment, which I think has been completely forsaken and is an important strain of thought in the conversation, but it hasn't been named and has been overshadowed by the response to modernity called postmodernity. So those are some things we were talking about. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well. I was really intrigued by whatever you guys were talking about as soon as I stepped on, like this notion of space and time and power, and the idea, if I was picking up correctly, that you were saying something like, or one of you was saying something like, the event is causal based and therefore spatial based or spatially based, meaning you have to change your space for an event, or I'm not sure if I got that quite right. Something about the need to escape space as power. Anyhow, I was just, the one thing that I guess I'd contribute just blindly is I think a lot about time and space, but I don't do a lot of thinking about space and time in terms of sort of lines of flight or power dynamics in the human world. Although it's a peripheral interest. But my understanding of Deleuze's pure difference is pure repetition, and my understanding of how pure repetition could be pure difference is that pure repetition happens as pure difference along the temporal axis, and so the only differentiating factor is the change in time. And so that pure difference is essentially a marker of just pure process of time. So even taking Heraclitus, you know, same river twice, even further, and as opposed to saying, well, yeah, it's a different river because actually different water is flowing through, taking it a step further and saying it's a different experience, even if it's the exact same moment of water, because it's happening in the next moment. And so I wonder, I just asked myself, you know, can event occur by way of time only, as opposed to space? And would it be possible for event to be pure difference? I think about this a lot in terms of repetition and redundancy. My initial inclination, of course, is that redundancy yields nothing new. But is that does not blend well with what I've been thinking about more recently, and the notion of sublation, actually, which is that vis-a-vis a certain threshold being crossed, a certain saturation of redundancy, up to a certain limit, phase shifts occur, massive events occur that are really transformational. And so if we think about this in terms of time and space, now, of course, a limit implies spatiality as well. But we can abstract, I think, from spatiality in terms of limit and think about limit across time, so that we have a temporal sort of limitation. In other words, a certain conglomeration of redundancy across time creates a sort of limiting threshold after which some sort of transformation occurs. And, you know, that throws a lot into question for me with regard to things that I'm historically really aggressively against, like tradition, redundancy, you know, repetition. If repetition is pure difference by the measurement of time, and theoretically, then you don't need space to create an event. All you need is time. And yeah, anyway, those are my initial thoughts on that.
That was magnificent. I put in the chat
Javier's video on the hermeneutics of space, which was something that we were talking about. It's a lovely video, and how, like, what ends up happening if space is the foundation of our rational thinking, then, for example, power is owning space, owning private property, the people who control space. Freedom becomes overcoming space, say becoming a disembodied individual online, and now you have freedom. And if you don't in your thinking have time have a primary function, then the only way is either to own all the space or to escape space, which then sets you up to be algorithmically, I can't say that word, captured, or to just be a capitalist that owns all private property. And I think also what you're saying, yeah, with Deleuze, it's kind of like, not only is the river never twice, but the foot is never the same, you know, everything is never the same, right? And so but it's funny because the effort to try to repeat unveils that changing, right? Because it's only when you literally try to repeat the same thing that you see that that pure repetition is always actually a pure difference. And that's why the repetition has the funny function of actually unveiling the difference. But that means you have to be engaged in the repetition. And that's also where I unveil like true infinity in Hegel, with involving this repetition that actually has the unveiling of the pure difference. And I really do also like, and I'll give it to Javier because what you were saying on event, on the notion that the repetition can lead to a saturation that then has a phase shift. So the event shows up. But then that, if I'm tying it, and then I'll give it to Javier, the language of Caputo and Rollins and all these different people, you have to have the willingness to risk the repetition just being empty. Because it kind of naturally feels like repetition is empty, right? It really actually feels naturally like Hegel's spurious infinity isn't spurious at all. It actually feels like, no, that's the real infinity, Hegel. What are you talking about? He's like, no, that's just adding +1, man. You're like, no, don't say that. Don't say that. And actually, it's the commitment to the repetition that makes possible the saturation that then has the phase shift. But there has to be the quote unquote real choice, as I like to call it, the commitment to that, which then requires doing the internal work to handle that. So I really like what you were saying, but let me give it to Javier here. I mean, that was very nice.
I think this is why, you know, I like hearing Ebert's thoughts on this as well, because a lot of my thinking has been going on time and space. Ironically, I started thinking about space recently because I was like, I think this needs to be addressed. But Ebert is right about time having a limit. And the way I limit time, just like the way Caputo does and Derrida, is that it never has to arrive. It should never arrive. Basically, it's messianic time without the Messiah, because you never want the Messiah to come. It's disastrous if the Messiah arrives. It's horrible if the Messiah arrives. So the limit is the fact that it's always intending to arrive. At least that's how I have it associated it as time as such. But unfortunately, because we are always spatially thinking, every event that we cut in time is technically a non-event. A non-event always intending to arrive. But, you know, I've been trying to think, you know, how do we have a new relationship to space? Because I think, you know, obviously space is a sort of inevitable relation that we're always going to have. You know, do we remedy that by sort of having having an actual relationship to time? Or do we remedy that with sort of having a different hermeneutic of space, which is what I have been trying to postulate, because there's an element of space, in my opinion, that actually promotes the element of self-forgetting. And I really like the elements of self-forgetting in space, because it's like, you can have this moment where you have this lack of spatial awareness in space, literally in space, and then run into an object without even knowing that you run into an object. And the same thing with how children interact with the world, is that children are dangerous just because they have a lack of spatial awareness. They actually don't have this positional illusion of sovereignty by having a position in space. And I think a lot of subjectivity, which I've been working on, I've been trying to strip the power of subjectivity without stripping subjectivity, which I've been finding very difficult to do, but I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to strip the illusion of power of subjectivity without stripping subjectivity, because there seems to be like this thing where it's like, it's either subjectivity or objectivity. We keep basing ourselves in this dichotomy. However, this dichotomy is strictly a hermeneutics of space, right? The very fact that you have a perceptual field, you're walking around, you see things opposed against you, different than you. This is, again, nothing in your perceptual field actually dictates this. It's your thinking that takes it up and interprets it as something different and opposed against you, which is why I'm trying to rethink that, because it's something that I find deeply problematic with the way we privilege our experience as a position of power. And I think like Owen talked about this in the literacy event, right? We keep talking about trauma. And I think that is something that is also an example of sort of privileging of the experience, the sovereignty of the subject as such, that they take their trauma as the event when the event itself is still unfolding. And if you take the event, and I think space has a bad repetition. This is what I'm going to promote. Space itself promotes a bad repetition, whereas time promotes the more healthy repetition that we keep wanting to do. And I think if the way Eber had described Deleuze correctly, then I think this is the repetition that we're trying to aim for. But it actually made me think that the way possibly people have been reading Deleuze is that we've been reading Deleuze spatially, which has caused for a bad repetition, possibly. It has caused a more pathological repetition. So I don't know. I mean, it's things that kind of got prodded up in my mind when Eber was talking about this.
What you're getting at is very important. You know, Deleuze is quite a fan of Bergson. He's quite a fan of Spinoza. He does a lot where he reverses Duns Scotus. And ultimately, he's going to use Nietzsche's eternal return to promote sort of like to blend his metaphysics with a certain ethical conception. And basically for Deleuze, yes, if there was just space, there wouldn't be repetition. There would just be the constancy of the moment. That wouldn't even be a moment, right? Like repetition is a temporal term, right? And so for Deleuze, it is by repetition that you actually have dare I say, the truth of time be unveiled as what makes the repetition possible. The irony is that when you repeat something, it seems like nothing happens. You're just repeating, right? And he's like, no, it is in that nothing happening that you realize nothing is not nothing, that actually there is always a newness. There is always a difference that is unfolding, because it's never, he starts difference and repetition saying something like, we've conflated universal and general. Oh gosh, this is like classic Deleuze, but it's like something where we've conflated two terms that mean general and universal, and that screwed us all up. They're not like the same thing. And that's where he's going to base his entire thought on. And so, whereas we associate repetition with sameness, he wants to bring out that repetition unveils difference. And he does something with Nietzsche's eternal return, where he's like, the eternal return would actually be the revelation of the impossibility of return. The internal return would be an eternal return to the place where the impossibility of return is realized. So those are all the fun sort of jumps he wants to make. The issue then becomes, the other topic would then be, okay, I've said it before, and I'll just have to let you take my word for it. The problem becomes that Deleuze makes an enemy of epistemologies of representation. And by doing that, you then lose the possibility of meaningful relation beyond an acknowledgement of your essential difference by the other. Okay. Now, if you were to add the dialectic to Deleuze, and Zizek even argues that Deleuze is dialectical and doesn't know it, that's the great anxiety of influence, right? That Bloom talks about. If you do that, then you can get Deleuze to something more Whiteheadian or Bergson or all of these different conceptions. But I do think you have to work Deleuze to that. Now, again, someone may hear that and say, no, you idiot. On page 600 of 1,000 Plateaus, he makes very clear X, Y, and Z. And I'm sorry, so I'm not sure. But that is my understanding of difference and repetition, that one has to make that move in order to do that. But two, also on what you're saying on time. Yeah, there's a way in which we can say space is primary and time is relative to space, I guess would generally be an Einstein conception. Whereas it's like in Bergson, who I am a layman on, and everything I say must be taken with a grain of salt, there's a notion in which time is primary and space is holographic relative to that creative evolution. So all moments of space contain all knowledge of space within, like a hologram is where every part contains knowledge of the whole. Okay, so you can't break time up into past, future, and present, but they are distinct, but it is unveiled in the present, of which contains all of that information, and space is a manifestation of that fullness of time. So what you say, like, it's not that space is fake, it's that space is an unfolding of the hologram, I suppose. Now, again, take all of that with a grain of salt. All of that might be entirely wrong, but that is the kind of move that seems that you have to make, where space is, space doesn't go through time. You know, it's not that space goes through time. In Bergson, it's almost as if space is the computation of the information of time, the hologram. And then that gets into the perceptible abilities of the mind to do that. And I'm not completely sure how that all works in his system, but that seems to be the shift in thinking that's very primary.
The way I think about time, I mentioned last time, time is sort of a just relation. Time collapses when relation is completely compressed. Time likewise collapses when light is compressing relation vis-a-vis speed, and being everywhere all at once. And space, you know, I haven't read Bergson almost at all, just blips, mostly to grab argumentation against people promoting Bergson. But if what you're saying is anywhere near what he was saying, I would agree with that. That space is essentially a blueprint of relation, whereas time is sort of the relation itself. Yeah, I don't know. I'm very interested. By the way, also just a note on boredom. I think two things that haven't been properly excavated philosophically are boredom and cool. And boredom is very, very important. I think that boredom is very important in terms of the progressive narrative, because the you know, the messianic time that progressives, I like that phrase a lot, by the way, Javier, that progressives are secretly operating on, where they pretend that they want a culmination toward progress of some kind, a heaven on earth or a utopia, or some point at which progress is no longer necessary, and you know, we've worked it all out. But we don't actually want that, because we've arrived at that state a number of times, and boredom sets in, and so we engage with our oppression compulsion and figure out new lines of flight. And I guess I'm just really interested in the lines of flight concept, or the idea of power expressing itself temporally or spatially or both. But I like the idea of, like, what can power exert itself purely temporally? Can it exert itself purely spatially? If they're the same thing and time is relation, then obviously power would have to express itself temporally, which would mean that I would begin to think about power as not an intersubjective force, but an agent of its own. So that I would begin to think of power as a movement in and of itself, which movement, like the projection of light or the projection of your voice, would move from relation to relation, and the amount of power could be measured, the distributions of power could be measured by how thick, how congealed that agent of power relates itself to other objects, other subjectivities, such that, for instance, a power that is very strong obviously coheres a lot more objects than a power that is weak. And so you have the more unified a power, the more unified a disparate distribution of elements is, the stronger that power has to be to sort of cohere them. And so you can have localized power that's only strong within a certain locale, which means that it's only so strong from relation to relation, which means sort of it's stopping time in a sense, but only locally. So there's sort of a local suspension of time vis-a-vis the total relation, saturation of that power amongst those elements. And, you know, and that stoppage of time works itself in, not just because it works sort of like on a quantum level, but it works itself into a sort of mimetic level, where we have these institutions or local groups or larger affiliations that we identify with largely subconsciously, I think, to negate or eternalize ourselves by projecting ourselves into an abstraction. And all abstractions are, of course, immortal on a certain level, or negate time by compressing time. So they negate time by compressing relations. So that the more immortal, like, you know, Christianity is pretty fucking immortal because of the amount of psychic energy being pushed into the term, being pushed into the image of Christ. And the more congested that image, the thicker that mascot becomes, the more it negates time, the more we have this vicarious immortality through our association with it. So anyway, going off right there, but yeah.
No, that was fantastic.
And a few things. As I understand Bergson, which again, take with a grain of salt. Bergson is someone, like I was telling Javier at the beginning, there's these books I've read like 10 years ago that I've been reading again this year. And I'm like, I can't read. I just feel like I can't read. It's like, I can't read. I read this book and didn't get any of this. And I'm like, the words passed in front of my eyes, but clearly I did not read it. And that's how I've been feeling. And likewise with Bergson, I read a lot of Bergson. I was like, okay, whatever. And now I'm like, maybe. Bergson seems to suggest that, and I really like what you're saying about time being relation, okay? Because that seems to be correct. And that Bergson wants to say that, and then it gets mixed with Whitehead, and Whitehead's defending Bergson. And again, I read Whitehead, but now I feel like I didn't read Whitehead. I don't know. Every relation contains all the information for all the relation. And that memory is the unfolding of that relation. And it is a compressial structure, like you were saying, that it's compressed and it's brought out. And the problem is that it's like what happens, Javier, it's almost what you can say is the problem of thinking spatially is you forget that space is an uncompression of the relation. And you forget that it contains all the information. You treat each part as its own whole of information, almost like when Hegel's talking about the one, you know, like all these little ones that relate to themselves, but nothing else in that sense, right? And so there's something about where Bergson is like memory is somehow the unfolding of that compression, of which then has a holographic structure. Okay. And then there's that channel with the Robson guy who talks about Bergson's holographic universe, and he seems like a genius. I've watched a little, don't claim any expertise at all. But it seems to mesh with all of this. And then what you would say as a giant claim is that basically the metaphysics of the modern counter-enlightenment indeed aligns with that. Whereas the metaphysics of the Enlightenment and postmodernity, in being based on a self-relation, is ultimately not like that. Space becomes primary, time is relative to space, and every moment relates to itself, as opposed to being an unfolding of all the information, like in a holographic structure. So this conception of this metaphysical conception that might be located in Whitehead and Bergson, and then other thinkers, but we'll take those two, seems to be a resource to avoiding the power traps, capture, and all these other things that you get from modernity. So that is a tentative thesis that would require understanding those thinkers better, which then I would say, not to throw it in, I think it's valid, aligns with things like the metaphysics of adjacency and Layman Pascal, which I think aligns with the science of logic and so on. But all of that has to be written and argued. On boredom, 100%. Boredom is like the result of, we were talking about the difference between the 100% and the 99%, like the layman stuff. Boredom is the 100%. Boredom is what arises when you have a map that in your mind equals the territory, ironically. You think you're going to have your supreme unity, the dream of the totalizing system, is boredom. Funny enough. And then that creates the pathology. So I think it is indeed, just to your point, philosophically rich. And then I'll pass it on to whoever wants to speak, because boredom critically is not a state where you have nothing to do. It's a state where you see no significance in what you could do. So like, I could always go to the movies. I could always take a walk. There's always something to do. It's where one does not see significance to do. And I think it also happens, referencing Nietzsche's Gay Science Book 5, 360, which is a section I've fallen in love with. It emerges when one confuses will with purpose. When one confuses that that's also when will moves to purpose in Nietzsche. That's where you confuse will and time and becoming with space. Purpose is space. And so it dies. And so that's an argument I make, but whoever wants to speak.
I just say there's a tie into sublation, because the sublated moment is the totalized moment.
Yes.
It's non-dynamical. And so I think that the self-relating negativity that starts the next dialectic, or starts the sort of negativity that becomes positivity and then ends up in another sublation, where you have this condensation of frequencies and the saturation, self-relating saturation, that actually the at least in the human mind, the thing that is the self-relating, or that sets off the self-relating negativity of the sublated moment, of the success, of the whatever it is just boredom. And that, we have this intrinsic thing, and there's an intrinsic contradiction, but we can very cleanly explain it just in a way that everyone's experienced, which is, it's just boredom.
Yeah. I think
of arrival. Yeah.
I think it's magnificent. And I will also, so I've been like pulling out thoughts from the science of logic for this counter-modernist paper. And I've been using your paper on the sublation of mathematics so much because the wave metaphoric structure really brings out so much of this. Obviously, it's so funny because now you're like the relation of repulsion and attraction. Oh, it's so obvious now. And it's just so well done, sir, with that imagery. But Javier, I know you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, I don't know if you guys see that anime One Punch Man, but it's like literally the funniest thing, because it's a parody of what happens if we do the 100%. Because it's a fucking joke. Like literally One Punch Man is so bored that the anime is actually ironically not about him. It has to actually focus on characters that can't kill things with one punch. He only arrives at the end when it feels impossible to defeat the enemy, that One Punch Man actually comes in, which is a hilarious critique of the idea that if we actually go 100%, we will be fucking bored out of our minds, because the very first episode, I believe, One Punch Man spends time trying to kill a fly that he can't kill because he's just like, he can defeat everything. But it's the fly that occupies his time because he can't kill it. But I do think, Iber's right on this. Like this saturation that he's talking about, it's like occupation The fact that when you're bored, you're like, how do I occupy my time? What do I do? And it's like the very idea that we associate occupation most of the time with oppression. You basically oppressed yourself with the very idea of boredom. The moment that happens, what are you doing? Yeah, that's my comments.
Oh no, there is a way in which the
Absence of boredom as a philosophical topic. Now you see it in literature. You see it in like Berdyaev, I was thinking the freedom of the human spirit. You see it in some of that, but it's almost like for philosophy or global capitalism and all those things to take boredom seriously, you have to like change everything, right? Like that, you can't allow that as a serious, it has to be, if you're bored, it's your fault. Like that's what the system has to do. Like it's your fault, Javi. It's your fault, Daniel. It can't be a feature of the system. It has to be your failure to connect to the system, right? So we kind of other it to the individual and then push that individual out. But if in fact there is something about totalizing visions or complete all these different things that creates boredom, well, that would be like that would be the revelation of the incompleteness of A is A, right? Like that would completely transform how you consider the socioeconomic system. Now, as it becomes increasingly undeniable, as time goes on, then the responses emerge. But unfortunately, without the resources of the modern counter-enlightenment, in my opinion, all we have to respond to that boredom is with a postmodern reaction that doesn't defeat the modernist structure. In fact, it makes it stronger precisely because of the apparent absurdism of the postmodern response. And so it doesn't work. It's like the end of Snowpiercer, where the revolution is part of the mechanism of control. So no, boredom is a very, like, it makes me think of Chekhov. It makes me think of the literary writers, Lancelot, Walker Percy. I'd have to go through it as being very robust, but it is not philosophically considered because again, it's just your fault. It's your fault. You ought to, it's like this obsession. Like I'm always fascinated. It's another topic, and why not bring up another topic at the end? I'm really fascinated by this like obsession with, how do I put it? Like Tim Ferriss, all this kind of like obsession with self-optimization. Like there's kind of this like obsession with, like how to be the best employee, how to like run 5 miles, write a novel, and be good at making love all in the same hour before noon. Like this kind of like obsession with how to sleep less and get more done and all that. There's something good with that, right? There's a way in which that could be good. But the problem is, for me, it doesn't feel very often. I'm not sure. It doesn't feel very often like an expression of Nietzsche's like intrinsic motivation, will, creative spirit. It often feels, one, captured by capitalism. Two, it feels like it's your fault if life sucks. It feels like a scapegoat almost. I don't want to bring in Girard. That's always dangerous because then the conversation gets taken over by Girard. Girard has this ability. Once you introduce Girard, I've noticed this in every conversation, like all the different things. Once you introduce Girard, it like spreads and takes over. But there is something, and I do think Battling to the End is a lovely text and Falling Like Lightning. But anyway, and his book on Shakespeare I'll have to read. But anyway, there's something about like a scapegoating of that almost seems to function as avoiding the essential problem of boredom in the system. Because if you can always go run 5 miles, if you can always like optimize yourself, then you have no excuse to be bored. And you ought to, because if you don't, you're a failure. And it's somehow where all of that stuff strikes me as a mechanism of denying an essential it's almost like a way to deny that the boredom, the loss of all these is somehow an essential feature of the system, which makes me think of Notes to the Pod, Raymond's book, and Studies in Thymos, and that gets into that. Owen's done some tremendous work on that, which I really appreciate. And it's almost like it feeds into that. I'd be curious if anyone has any comments on that. And then I did mention Girard, so now there has to be a comment on Girard. It's just how it works nowadays. So.
Daniel, do you ever get those like little advertisements from Substack? Like, we can help you grow your page. We can optimize your page so you can get more followers, Daniel.
Javier, I'm going to be honest with you.
The moment I see the word optimization, blood shoots out of my nose. So I'm not really good whenever I see the word optimization. I really hate that word, frankly, because it's such a, oh, wow. Now I'm just bashing things. I don't even have a philosophical tradition to put it in. So it's just like, no, there's something about this optimization. I haven't written a paper on it. and I've been thinking about it. I've gathered a lot of scattered notes. There's something about, and Michelle, please, there's something about the optimization talk that is poisonous. And it makes me think of Ebert's on cancer. Like, it's like live forever. There's something where it's like live and it's cancerous. There's something about it that's also like, well, your standard of optimization is space, right? Your standard of optimization is technology and productivity and all these things. And who controls the meaning of those terms, right? Oh, you know, that gets into all of that. So there's something about it, but yes, I do get those. I also wanted to note that One Punch Man is hilarious. And I am tempted to bring in, like, what was it? Like, it's like whenever Superman becomes evil, that's like the best, right? Like, I was like, oh, right, now there's something cool going on. Or like that whole, I read it when I was younger. What was it called? It was by the guy who did Walking Dead, Kirkman. He did something called Invincible, I think. And in that one, the enemy is basically Superman. And like, it's crazy, right? So Michelle, please.
Hey guys, thank you so much all for your insights. Always wonderful to listen in. I've been thinking a lot about like teleology lately and directionality. And I guess, you know, the question always remains with like optimization and things like that, where it's like optimized toward what, like relative to what, right? And I guess I'm just thinking though, like teleology is a type of directionality, right? So it's like, it has to do though with space and time. And I guess I'm just thinking like, I don't know, I guess I'm just thinking about the fact that it's like, though there can be risks with space, it's also like we only ever have relation because of time. And we only kind of know what we're trying to go for or what our goal is because of it. So in that way, I guess I'm thinking about like, could teleology possibly or something like that? I hope that made sense as a question. But yeah, that's my...
No, I think that's magnificent. And I can't wait to call this episode One Punch Man.
That's going to be what we're going. It's going to be so good. Out of the net. 23, One Punch Man. Without teleology, I think it becomes very difficult to determine order. And basically, all of these problems are a matter of order. Like space, when seen as, say, the information of the relation of time, or blueprint, that's the word Ebert used. I really like that word. Like, then it's fine. It's necessary even, and it has a role. Like, I've always been a fan of that Augustine notion that evil is a disordered good. Likewise, it tends to be a problem of order, right? There's nothing wrong with technology. It's when it's disordered. And when you get a technology that is like super, super difficult to order because of the nature of how it controls you and ontological design and all those different things. So I think teleology in the question of like, what is it for, or so forth and so on, is indeed primary. But then of course the trick becomes, how do you have teleology without turning Nietzsche's will into purpose? And that's what I've kind of been thinking a lot on, but I think that's a magnificent point.
Just a point on the optimization without a telos seems to me to be very easy to exploit people's motivation, because if you have a telos, you have a certain kind of ethical and kind of some sort of standards by which you behave or act to try actualize something higher. Where if you don't have a telos, and I just got in the comment section there, you optimize to be optimal. So you always have this like super ego injunction in you to be productive and optimal, but you're like running around in circles, like in circles, like a headless chicken, wondering what the hell am I being optimal towards? Like, what is this? But it's quite easy to then like hijack people's motivation and like desire to create or desire to work or produce or build because they don't have a telos. They kind of have no standards by which they're kind of going to be guided by, or no kind of path to be guided by. It's just like you have a bundle of energy, and then you have all these forces, whether it's corporations or whether it's propaganda forces or whether it's what technologies can kind of come into this ball of like optimizing energy and just mold it into this like horrific things, which has and there's no way to kind of defend ourselves and be like, okay, I've got this energy. I want to optimize. I want to improve myself. You know, like self-improvement is a big topic now today. But I don't want to do it in that way. I have a specific standard in which I'm going to achieve that by. And without a telos, I think we're just kind of like lost without a standard. And then we're just molded into things we don't even want to be, and so on.
I think it's exactly right. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. I think also teleology is where you have to think time, right? Like you have to think of what is it toward, where is it going, and it moves you out of this kind of spatially dominant thinking. And the other thing, it's like, yeah, we're basically like Sisyphus. I know how you can smile as you push that boulder. You push a bigger boulder and you sleep less so you have more time to push boulders. That's when you'll smile, Sisyphus. That's your problem. So no, but let me give it to Mr. Ebert.
I'm probably wrong about this, but I feel like there's, as far as humanity goes, and maybe even the universe and matter goes, there's really one teleology, which is non-dynamism. I just see everything headed toward non-dynamic, and I see us really working to be non-dynamic ourselves. I mean, it's the whole idea of retirement. And but anyway, I put together a short list on something I hadn't published yet. It's about immortality projects and the general neurotic aims of human greatness, essentially being attempts to freeze change, to contract time into, and again, we're talking about time and space, but to contract time and space into an eternalized state. So, you know, some of these are stretches, but I'll start with the least stretch in my mind. Technology's neurotic aim is instantaneity. So, you know, no change in elapsed time, temporal inertia. So from the carrier pigeon to the instant message, from the fire pit to the microwave, the covered wagon to the rocket ship, the abacus to the quantum computer, ideation to actuation is being constricted to full collapse, such that, you know, time evaporates through collapse of relation, through, you know, excess relation, again, excess absence. Anyway, I go through some of the philosophy's neurotic aim seems to be omniscience, although we never claim it. It seems to be a tacit compulsion, which would be no change in the degree of knowledge. So just this static state of knowing. Actually, that describes absolute knowing. The state's neurotic aim is external stability, no change in power. Religion's neurotic aim is internal stability, no change in belief. Fame's neurotic aim is societal immortality, no zeitgeist death. Architecture's neurotic aim is societal immortality, from Great Wall of China, blah, blah, blah. Medicine's neurotic aim, of course, is physical immortality. So we have this idea of like achieving some sort of static collapse of dynamism, where we're no longer living, dying, we're just living, and technology saying like we're just communicating and it's just instant and there's no movement in between anything. And I find that really fascinating. Like why do I see that as the teleology of basically absolutely everything? And then if that's correct, why are we so driven toward non-dynamism? What's so attractive about it? And to me, the obvious thing is that it negates death. And by negating time. And so, it's very interesting.
I think that's brilliant. I think the challenge is
indeed when one talks about teleology that it not be purpose. You know, it maintains like a direction of will without it turning to purpose, like Nietzsche said, because that's the static state. And that's what seems so insanely difficult. Like traditionally, like if we get back into where you would say Aristotle, the final calls, Aquinas, all that, where teleology is like with a final state, that seems to be a mistake. And it does indeed. Like another reason why we don't want to talk about boredom is because so many people in retirement are bored. And if you took seriously boredom, you would have to rethink the entire kind of structuring system that people live their lives for, right? And so we'll just pretend like that's not a problem. And I do think there's a subconscious, semi-pre, there's all these different words now, for conscious desire for immortality found in a stable state. That actually, the funny thing is that's another example of irony like we've talked about, where you're trying to avoid death with a stable state, and that's a state of like spiritual death per se, of boredom. Like that's why I'm always fascinated with irony as kind of the structure of human action. Like we do things to escape things, and that's precisely why we end up in a version of that thing.
It's a proxy. It's that death drive paradox of running unconsciously from death and creating these essentially reproductions of death as eternalization views. It's super strange.
Yeah, now I'm thinking about as a final part, because I fear I will have to leave, and I've really enjoyed this. Owen, thank you for being here today. It's wonderful to have you, Mr. Ebert, Michelle. Javier left because, you know, he wanted to go watch One Punch Man. But it makes me think of kind of a metaphor for, it makes me think of mummies. Because there's something so funny about mummies, right? It's like you're going to live forever as a mummy. And it's kind of almost like this infinite, it's like this repetition of these various mummifications, where we're like, once I'm a mummy, then I won't die. But it's actually a preservation of a stable state of boredom or a kind of death. There's some kind of living mummification that occurs in these ironies of the death drive. I'll have to think about that, but I just had like the joke of being a mummy. That because so much of these mummifications is kind of an effort to like live forever, right? You don't. That's not how that works, but it kind of like convinces you that it does. But that's interesting. But anyway, I appreciate your time today, friends. You're magnificent, Owen, Mr. Ebert. Always a pleasure. I will try to get I'll try to get out the things on the modern Counter-Enlightenment. And Owen, I always appreciate the reading you do on the thinkers you do, because I do think they fit in that space, which is a critical alternative and can help us avoid some of these unintentional death drives. But thank you so much today, everyone. Y'all been, it's always a delight. Thank you, friends.
Thanks for having me late in the mix. I appreciate it.
It is a delight, Mr. Ebert. It is always a treat. Thank you for stopping in. Owen,
thank you. It's my first time. It's been a pleasure. I'll be back.
Yay! Well, thank you, Owen. I always appreciate work. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. It was a treat, real treat.